Whitney Lackenbauer is a professor at Trent University, and he's got a very fancy title, a Tier 1 research. Tell us what that is. I know it's very elite.
I'm fortunate to be a beneficiary of a Canada Research Chair, so it's a federally funded program. And my official title, because each one is unique, is on the study of the Canadian North, which I love because it's broad and expansive, and it's past, it's present, it's future, it's interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary. It means lots and lots of things relating to Canada's North and Arctic affairs.
It gives you all the room in the world to do what you please, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Fabulous. Okay. Let me start by asking what this thing was. You got hijacked. You couldn't be with us right on time because you were moderating something called Emerging Leaders. And I want you to explain that before we get down to business.
So I'm really fortunate in that I serve a wonderful team, a network of scholars and practitioners funded by Canada's Department of National Defence and Mobilizing Insights in National Defence and Security, or MINDS program, who fund a North American and Arctic Defence and Security Network, or NADCEN. So as part of this network, which has 100 plus sort of scholars, activists involved in it, we also have an Emerging Leaders node. It's led by Cheryl Mitchell, who's one of our brilliant graduate fellows. She's working on a master's at Trent University right now. And she's organized a student seminar, so a conference for students, graduate students, to come and share research and ideas. So I was brought in at the last minute to moderate a session today. And again, once again, just astounded at the brilliance and creativity, of a lot of these students who are out there informing our work. And again, really, really fortunate to be receiving this funding from National Defence in a way that's very liberating. I can imagine some audience members might think, oh my gosh, that means he's bought and owned by the military industrial academic complex. Actually, my experience has been very much the opposite. It's that it's funding that really encourages us to contribute ideas to the defense team, as academics, as thinkers, and really to explore areas relating broadly defined to North American and Arctic defense and security. So broadly beyond the sheer national defense mandate, but to encompass a bunch of other intersecting issues. So really wonderful to get to interact days like today with, students, and then follow it up with an esteemed journalist like yourself to talk about the implications of the Arctic and how it fits within the world as things are evolving.
Well, it sounds like you have a whole network of students at Trent who are working on Arctic issues. Is that the case, or is it that you just attract them like flies?
Well, I would say we have a small but mighty group of students at Trent working on Arctic related issues. The wonderful thing about this network is it truly is national in its breadth, from coast to coast to coast, and in the engagement, as well as international. So some wonderful thinkers from the United States, from Europe as well, participating actively within it, and really just trying to encourage a deeper dialogue about Arctic security and what that means and what that should encompass, and what perhaps is not helpful to bundle together into Arctic defense and security the way it's sometimes instrumentalized by certain groups. So, and again, there's also a vigorous discussion that played out this morning at the group as well about what do we mean when we talk about security? Do we talk about really something requiring, like when we face an existential threat to our very being, it often requires extraordinary action. Part of the questions that the students were engaging in was, what exactly constitutes an existential threat in an Arctic context? Are these threats likely? Are they probable things, or just possible imagined eventualities? And then how extraordinary should our action be? Because if you're going to take extraordinary action, you actually take things outside of normal politics, out of our democratic institutions and our processes to undertake really dramatic action. So really, I think a challenge for a lot of decision makers, policymakers is, when are we crossing a threshold where we need to act outside of our normal process? And when is it best to just continue to advance our interests, to build our resilience, to build our capabilities within those normal functions of what we do in a great country like Canada?
I think the easiest way out of that pickle is to call it human security, because it uses the word security, but it really means peace and justice and environmental stability and end of hunger, and all of these other things that go with living well. And I think the word human security almost can be used as a synonym for the notion of peace, in this broader sense that I use the word peace, which includes a lot of other things, justice and an opportunity to flourish. So anyway.
I agree, Meta. I think when I think about security, sometimes I'm informed by a group of thinkers out of Copenhagen, often referred to in international relations in Copenhagen School, who talked about sectors of security. So, you have military security, which often many people just sort of associate with security writ large, but it's a certain category. Then you've got political security. We often in Canada talk about sovereignty. I often think what we're really talking about is political security, the right for Canada to control activities within areas that we see falling within our jurisdiction or ownership. We have economic security, right? Our freedom to pursue trade and have an economy. We have environmental security, things relating to the environment. And then we have security of collectivities of people, of a society. So I think actually human security is not just within the societal sector. It also relates to the other sectors. So we sometimes go from a very narrow definition of security focused on nation states, focused on militaries. But then I like what you're suggesting, which is at the same time, we also need to deepen that vision of security and think about security of individuals, of families, of communities, of peoples in all parts of the world, including in the Arctic.
Well, my impression is that during the past year, there have been some real reversals, and not to the beneficial side, in the Arctic in two dimensions. And that is, it's not just in the last year for the other security, but two things. One is the global warming, where everything is vulnerable, and more vulnerable than ever. The other being even a change in the security in the sense of international relations among the Arctic countries. Because, for example, less than a year ago, I think in Peace Magazine, Elizabeth Riddell Dixon, who's a specialist on mostly, I think, the boundaries of the countries under the ocean, where the Arctic shelf lands and that sort of thing. But I mean, she wrote an article for us in which she was kind of agitated about the fact that people are always talking about the military in the Arctic as if we are always in trouble, that we don't get along with Russia, and that she says, don't worry, everything's fine. The Russians are very cooperative, and everybody gets along with everybody else in the Arctic, and you're making trouble when you talk about things as problematic, because it's not. We're all getting along fine, thank you very much. So please act that way. Well, I don't think that's true anymore. My impression is that I've been in touch with some Russian scientists that I want to interview on the show, and the first thing I ask is, "Don't you know about the ban?" What ban? Well, the ban on scientific cooperation between Russians and other people, and I say I don't think there is such a thing. And so I don't know where that stands, but clearly the global warming thing is not getting better; it's getting worse, and it's going to get worse. And the Arctic people are feeling the brunt of it. And on the other hand, I'm unpeeling a cough drop. So if you wonder why I'm not looking at the cameras, I'm unpeeling a sticky cough drop. And but there's a worsening situation, the plight of people living there and having to cope with it. But also, isn't it true that the international relations are going down the tube?
Well, Meta, one of the ways that I like to think about these issues is almost parsing or categorizing things in terms of threats through the Arctic, threats to the Arctic, and threats in the Arctic. So when I think about what's happening globally in terms of deterioration of international cooperation, when we look at Russia's, brutal further invasion of Ukraine and the destabilizing effect that that has on the international system. When we look at heightened strategic competition, we often say great power competition, but to me, that's just privileging way too much the United States and Russia and China. There are other people who are involved in this high level competition. I don't think that has fundamentally changed the nature of the risks in or to the Arctic.
Mm.
I see it as changing the equation about threats that may pass through the Arctic. And your viewers are going to be very familiar, especially those of us who lived through the Cold War, that this is not inherently new. The Arctic as being a threat or a thoroughfare, a route for, at that time, intercontinental ballistic missiles or strategic bombers, the shortest distance between Eurasia, northern Eurasia at least, and North America.
Mm-hmm.
So these are threats that aren't related to Arctic boundaries, as Elizabeth Riddle-Dixon, Professor Riddle-Dixon would have emphasized. They're not related to Arctic resource disputes or Arctic disputes more generally. This is global strategic competition that the Arctic gets pulled into. So there's a danger of global affairs spilling over and affecting Arctic relations. Absolutely. Certainly Finland and Sweden applying to become NATO members was really shocking to me. Not something that I thought I was going to see, at least short term.
Me too.
But it was Russia who changed the equation, right? They made it so that, my gosh, what Eastern European country now isn't thinking, Russia was scary, threatening us when we weren't NATO members. But by gosh, at least if we're NATO members, we have that backing, under Article 5 of collective security in NATO to protect us. So those are the threats through the Arctic, and we can come back to those. I'm not sure that I see the threats to the Arctic changing fundamentally, because the big one, in my view, has always been climate change, or at least in the last quarter century, we've become aware of how deeply destabilizing this is. Mm-hmm. I say it's a threat to the Arctic because the causes are not from the Arctic. It's not the Arctic states. It's certainly not Arctic peoples that are leading to mass levels of global warming with all the effects this has on their communities and on their peoples and on their ecosystems, right? This is something that's global. So in essence, it's a threat to the Arctic. We can't undertake Arctic action in the sense that only confine our actions to the Arctic itself to deal with it. It requires global action. But then I also say there are threats in the Arctic that are dealing with the effects of climate change and environmental change. So that in essence, these are being realized. And again, some of us might be familiar with coastal erosion and permafrost degradation and more wave action in waters that are open for longer parts of the year, different forms of storms. One of my friends with whom I was speaking to just the other night in Iqaluit in Cambridge Bay, in Iqaluit or Cambridge Bay in Nunavut. So the central Canadian Arctic talked about a great big thunderstorm that they had. And I asked her, Amy, is this something you see very, very often? She's like, oh, no, very rarely. Like, these are not things you see. I asked, like, once a summer. She goes, oh, no, most years we don't get thunderstorms. It's these kind of patterns of weather changes that are becoming much more prevalent, but that actually drive up the uncertainty around the Arctic. So I think in that sense, Meta, when you're emphasizing the need to think about people, to think about the residents of the Arctic, to really think about security and peace in that very localized and specific way, it's really important to see that really does, yes, it connects to global drivers. Climate change is a global problem, but it actually requires us to think also about solutions that are really building up resilience and really reinforcing a lot of the capacity and capability that exists at a local level. And I think one of the challenges for the military is, how do we look to invest in military capabilities that can support communities in a helpful way, where communities are really partners, they're core rights holders, core stakeholders in all of this. I'm happy to chat about the Canadian Rangers because I'm their biggest fan, as an example of how we can sort of look at human security and have human security really being advanced in concert with some of these other security practices as well, which in my mind are really befitting the Canada that we are and want to be in the 21st century, which is maybe different than some of the practices of the Canadian state when it came to Arctic security, say in the 1950s, where certainly big action was taken to defend against what was then the Soviet Union threat. but certainly did not have Northern peoples involved in decision making or thinking about effects of these big projects like the building of the distant early warning or dew line, right? And the impacts that those had on actual peoples living there. I think now we have to rethink the way we involve people, and then also for Arctic leaders to think about which conversations do they want to be involved in when it comes to those threats through the Arctic, to the Arctic, and then in the Arctic.
You can do things that are local to build resilience in the communities there. And tell me more. What kinds of things are being planned or undertaken along those lines?
Thanks, man. It's wonderful. I'll use maybe examples from Inuit Nunangat. So this is the Inuit homeland within Canada. Sometimes people refer to Inuit Nunat, which is recognizing Inuit as a transnational people, a people that actually extends to 3 different nation states. But in this case, focus on the Canadian North. So some of the examples I love, the Canadian Coast Guard has invested a significant amount of resources in first relationship building, which is key, trust relationships, but then investing in a Canadian Coast Guard auxiliary in the communities so that members of communities receive training, also through a Transport Canada funded, Ocean Protection Plan funded small boats program, can be given small boats that can be used primarily for search and rescue on the waters, but also potentially to deal with a mass rescue operation, say if a cruise ship ran aground or some scenario like that. So really investing in communities to say, yes, we have the big red-hulled Coast Guard ships, icebreakers that go up north, perform really important missions in support of environmental security and human security in particular, but to have that complemented with investments in the people in the communities where they can stay in their communities, serve their communities, and at the same time be able to respond. We also have Indigenous Guardian programs. So Inuit Guardian programs where Inuit are funded both from their land claim organizations and also from the federal government to be guardians to undertake stewardship or conservation efforts within their home waters. So again, recognizing that ways of advancing reconciliation, finding ways of living better and working better together involves these investments in people. And another organization.
What do you mean by a guardian, though? What would this guardian do?
So their function is to be present and to be aware of ensuring that people are not undertaking illegal actions in their homeland. And that can include environmental contamination. Mm-hmm. And then really just being aware of what's going on in their homeland and being able to pass that along. So they receive specific training, but also apply Inuit Kanjit. So Inuit ways of knowing, Inuit ways of being, traditional knowledge, we sometimes refer to it, that is not just traditional knowledge, it's still very current relevant knowledge that they take out. Another organization is the Canadian Rangers. So these are members of the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves, but they're really different than any other military organization that I've seen, certainly within Canada, but I think even more broadly, in that they are considered to be trained upon enrollment. So it's not that the military needs to bring them in and break them down and then reconstitute them like it often does with soldiers. Rangers are something different. So in the north, particularly within Inuit Nunangat, the vast majority of rangers are Inuit who live in their community.
They're civilians at the moment, but it's like being an adjunct or something like that.
No, they're actually members of the Canadian Armed Forces. So they are members of the reserves. Okay. In southern Canada, we talk about the primary reserves, who are part-time soldiers, but still have quite strict medical requirements and training requirements in order to be able to serve. And one of the roles for the primary reserves is to be deployed overseas. So they complement our regular forces, on overseas missions. The Rangers are absolutely not trained or expected to serve overseas. In fact, that's not at all what's being asked of them. The idea is we want to have people involved in the Rangers who know their home communities, who are comfortable operating around their home communities, and can help to ensure that when Southern troops come up north, that you have guides, you have subject matter experts who are able to keep them not only alive on the land, but able to operate safely on the land. That benefits communities. It also benefits the Canadian Armed Forces.
Mhm.
Also, by having them as a group of people in the communities who are members of the military and supported by the military, they receive training that supports the military, but at the same time, they can go and use that to serve their communities, to keep their communities safe in times of disaster. They were certainly activated during COVID-19, during Operation Laser, for example. Yep, hired on. So they were there to be a presence in their community to make sure that the community needs were being supported. And I love it, because what a better model than having a bunch of outside military, personnel go and drop into a community, bringing whatever they're bringing with them in a COVID scenario, right? Better to have people actually present in a community who know the community, they have the relationships. These are all family, right? To be able to serve. And what I love is the Rangers take great pride in wearing their red hoodies, a very distinctive uniform, right? As members of the Canadian Armed Forces, but at the same time, really recognizing that they're not soldiers. That's not what they're signing up for. They're there to be Rangers. It's something distinct.
And
I
it's
love
not,
that as a
it's not
metaphor.
exactly a police force either, although it might include some of those functions, right?
It actually doesn't. And that's a great question, Meta. Two of the things that were explicitly excluded from the Rangers' tasks since the early 2000s are they're not expected and they're not trained to be engaged in combat. So again, if there was ever a war and the communities were attacked, many of my friends in the Rangers have said, of course they would go and take their Ranger rifle and they would defend their communities. That's not really what they're being asked for, and that's not the nature of the threats that primarily are concerning us in our Arctic. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they are not expected to serve in an aid to the civil power capacity. So as supports to law enforcement, for example. And again, this is not the official line, but my understanding is it's because that requires very specialized training, which, isn't needed for the Rangers to do their other roles. At the same time, I also think, gosh, that would be challenging, given that in many of these small communities, like in any small town, it would be really difficult to call upon Rangers to go and act in a law enforcement role when what they're really doing is interacting with family members or close friends. So in essence, by removing that consideration, it allows them to really focus on positive, constructive roles.
It sounds as if then that this role is closer to being a social worker than to be an enforcer of anything. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't describe it. There can be a social support role for it, and as you say, a human security role for it. But I'd say definitely an important role. And their fancy language I've used in the past in writings on the Rangers, they're a force multiplier or a real enabler for the military. So because they are trained just enough to understand the military and how the military works, it's wonderful, because when the military does come north for operations, it's the Rangers who really enable them to go learn how to live out on the land, how to operate out on the land, maybe teach them how to build snow houses, what many of us call igloos. Right? Igloo actually means any house in Inuktitut, but the ones that we see built out of a certain type of snow, right? Or how to set up a tent properly, or how to navigate over the land safely if your GPS goes out.
I was just wondering whether, the first thing you think of when you think of Inuit is somebody in an igloo, a snow house. And I wonder if they actually still use any of those things. Do they know, do ordinary people know how to build one? And do they ever actually live in one or spend the night in one?
So one of the great things about the Rangers, if I can connect it back to that, is by having the military support these community members who are serving as Rangers to go out on the land, it really encourages them to go and practice those skills, like building a snow house. So I've been involved in many Ranger patrols and exercises over the years, which have involved, including several that have involved going out and Rangers building snow houses. It's really wonderful to watch, because in communities where there's not many people who still have that skill set, it's a wonderful opportunity for some of the elders, let's say, or older Rangers with lots of experience building them, to teach younger Rangers or even junior Canadian Rangers, which are part of a youth program, right? Teaching them, sharing those skills and that knowledge, so that, and which is very important, if you ever do get stuck out of your community in a storm and your snowmobile breaks down, right? It's very valuable to be able to build a snow house to be able to keep warm until help can
Have you
arrive.
ever participated in building one?
Definitely, most certainly. I've spent several nights in them,
Really?
which are wonderful. I found it very surprising. Your viewers might also find it interesting, Matt. One of the things that was most interesting, first time I slept in one was 2009 in Tuktoyaktuk. So this is in the Western Canadian Arctic. And Emmanuel Adams, the Master Corporal of their local Ranger Patrol, and the other members built one. And then they said, Whitney, we volunteer you because you were really interested in how we were building it. You get to sleep in it. And I said, great, I love it. I'm so excited. What do I do? And they said, well, here's the 303 rifle. You shouldn't have to use it. We don't see many polar bears in this part. But just in case, right, you make sure here, because they'll sometimes come and come into them if they smell you. And then they said, during the night, also make sure you take, I think it was a willow branch or some sort of rigid but branch, and said, make sure every hour or so you poke holes in your igloo to allow the air to come in. Otherwise, it may seal up and you can suffocate. And people often ask me, well, how did you know to wake up every hour? And I said, when somebody tells you you need to wake up every hour, you might suffocate. Something deeply inside us gets us to wake up. So I don't think I slept very much that night, but it actually was very comfortable. There was nothing in there but a sleeping bag and a small Tim Hortons coffee can with a small candle, like a survival candle in it. And it was actually very, very comfortable. So it is wonderful to see that those skill sets still do exist in the North. I love the purposefulness of the military helping to support the sharing and the retention of those skills, and thinking this is a great example in my mind of how, there's so many examples that we're bombarded with on a daily basis in our media of, awful practices by the Canadian state, past and present, that have had really negative impacts on Indigenous peoples and other peoples living in remote and isolated regions. And I look at the Canadian Rangers as an example of one of those things that we have, and I think are continuing to get right. And it's important, I think, to have those stories as well. In my mind, not because it cancels out the things that we've done wrong. To me, it actually says to us, here are examples where we can get it right. It is actually possible to do things well. Maybe that actually puts even more impetus on us to think about the things we're not doing well and figuring out how we can do them better.
In that wonderful movie, the long runner, or
Atanarjuat, the fast runner.
Fast runner. Yeah, but they had a scene or several scenes in a snow house that seemed to be quite big. The whole community was in there. Now, is that realistic? Could they actually build a one the size of an ordinary room that you could get 15, 20 people in?
So I've never been in one that large, but certainly I've heard many stories of them being built. Some communities still do. Actually, I was just up in Whitehorse at the Junior Canadian Ranger camp a couple of weeks ago. And one of the rangers from Nunavut was telling me about them having just built this spring, a really big one, to be able to accommodate, the way they were describing, I imagine like 50 to 60 people inside of it. And they were very excited about having built one that large. I've been in one that, comfortably accommodated, sitting around the outside, about 15 people. So really, really significant. I remember cooking breakfast on a Coleman stove with one of the rangers for everyone, and it really being quite an amazing experience. So again, being able to build one of that size requires a significant amount of skill and knowledge, especially when you get up to especially if you're going to have a fully enclosed one.
The history of the people has often been quite, in the past, very bitter. Terrible things were done. And I don't know a lot about that, but I wonder to what extent that still is a factor in the nationalistic views. To what extent are Canadian Inuit feeling that they are Canadians? And you mentioned also that there are 3 Arctic countries that the Inuit belong to. Do they think of themselves more as affiliated with their Inuit relatives in, I don't know what these other 2 countries are. I suppose one would be Denmark. Denmark and is Greenland.
Greenland, Denmark, United States, and Alaska, Inupiat and Yupik people, and then Russia, Chukotka. Now,
the people in Russia are also Inuit.
There's a a relatively small population in Chukotka, but yes.
And they could speak to each other?
So different areas, the language, the different dialects can be pretty strong, but generally, yes, it's amazing that the language is generally mutually intelligible. 100 years ago, when Knud Rasmussen went from Greenland, from Thule, and across the Canadian Arctic to Alaska, he found it amazing that he was able to take his Greenlandic, language and be able to converse with Inuit all across. So it's quite amazing.
But there wouldn't
In
have
answer
been...
to your question, yeah, in answer to your question about the Canadianness, I mean, again, not one that as a Halunat, as a non Inuk, that's a weird turn of phrase, because I guess I am a person, and technically Inuit means the people, or Inuk is singular for the person. So I'm not saying I'm not a person, I definitely am, but not an Indigenous person of the Arctic. I'm loath to speak and characterize their thinking on the Canadian question on their behalf. I think there's a diversity of opinion on that. But one of the things I can share is that when I first started doing my research in earnest and met with Canadian Rangers, one of the questions I wanted to ask and did pose to several elders was, so how do you, and I said it, I think, much more naturally and normally at the time, but how do you somehow manage, being a Canadian and being an Indigenous person, and how does that affect you serving in the Rangers? And it took about 3 or 4 times where they just kind of said, Whitney, I don't understand your question. Like, I'm a Canadian and I'm an Inuk. Like, why are you setting it up like it's one or the other? Like, I was always struck by that, to say sometimes, identities are not like hats. We don't just wear one at a time. And I think for a lot of Canadian or a lot of Alaskan Inupiat or Yupik, they self-identify as Inuit, and when they gather as part of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, right, that Inuit identity is going to be first and foremost. But then there's also a strong sense of connection to and affinity with their country. So in Greenland, they have their own independence, aspirations as Greenland vis-a-vis the Kingdom of Denmark. But I don't sense that same groundswell within the Canadian Arctic, certainly not at this time. But certainly some Inuits within Canada identify more strongly with Canada than some others do. And I think of our Governor General Mary Simon, an Inuk from Kuujjuaq in northern Quebec, who once used the phrase Canadians first Canadians as a descriptor for Inuit place within Canada. I also think of one other elder one time when I was asking about how they managed having some of the trauma associated with some of these past practices as part of their lived experience, with also very much embracing being a Canadian Ranger and really celebrating their Canadian citizenship. And their point was, well, yeah, of course I'm critical of government, and I'm critical of Canada, because why wouldn't I be critical and add more of something I love so much? And me thinking, wow, talk about an inspiring different message of, yeah, absolutely. Expect more from something that you're a part of and that you're really investing in is something to me that's very natural and is actually part of this wonderful Canadian experiment. So,
but now there's
so again,
no easy, as I remember the map of the Arctic, there's no easy way for Inuit Canadians to contact Inuit Russians, because they're really far apart on the Arctic Ocean. So is there, you say that if you went along from Greenland through Canada to Alaska, that there's a sense of ethnic continuity to some extent. Is it different if you were to bring together Inuits from Nunavut or some other part of Canada with people from Russia? Would they have the same sense of identity as similar?
Great question, Meta. I can say I'm not sure how to answer that in light of global affairs. So again, to tie those relationships and how they're affected by developments outside of the Arctic, particularly the war in Ukraine. I'm not sure how Chukotkans would primarily affiliate in light of what I think are very reasonable and necessary Western sanctions on Russia and public opinion polling in Russia. I've not seen anything specific to Chukotka, but in Russia, public opinion polling suggesting that, I find it unfortunate, that's my own normative judgment, I guess, but unfortunate that most Russians appear to support Putin and this awful, illegal, violation of sovereignty and respect for human dignity and all the other words I could load onto that in a similar vein. What I'd suggest, though, is there's interesting mechanisms like the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is comprised of Inuit from all of those 4 countries that's been getting together since 1977. It's now a permanent participant, so an Indigenous peoples organization at the Arctic Council. But the ICC likes to remind us that it actually pre-exists the Arctic Council by quite a long time. And they worked very hard to expand to include Chukotkins. So their Russian brethren were also part of this organization. That's obviously a challenge right now in light of global developments. Also, we've seen the Arctic Council, which is the premier intergovernmental forum for the different Arctic countries, there are 8 of them, to meet, and also for Indigenous peoples through permanent participant organizations to also come and be part of the core conversations, the core group. The like-minded 7 Arctic countries, so those excluding Russia, have decided to put a pause on high-level meetings of the Arctic Council. So by extension, that means that also puts a pause on the ability for these Indigenous peoples organizations representing peoples from around the circumpolar world to also come together and have input into issues of, interest to several Arctic states. So there's a real tension, I think, right now, or a great deal of uncertainty right now about what Arctic governance is going to look like going forward, what the implications are for Arctic peoples and Arctic citizens themselves, and then what the implications are, even though the Arctic Council was deliberately designed to not include Arctic military issues. So it said, we will deal with lots of issues regarding the environment and sustainable development, and as you mentioned, meta-human security. They'll deal with emergency preparedness issues and search and rescue, but they will not deal with military security because that's divisive. Well, the sad thing is, when you get into a fracturing in global politics like we've seen recently, and when Russia undertakes action in Ukraine, it can't help but affect the ability for the rest of us to look at Russia as a trustworthy participant in Arctic affairs, where it's going to respect sovereignty, going to respect the dignity of people, and going to respect peace. So it's unfortunate because we then see a pause on Arctic affairs or Arctic governance, not because there's anything inherently broken in the Arctic. Russia invading Ukraine has not meant a Russian invasion of the Arctic, but it means that the Arctic can't be treated like it's somehow separate from the rest of the world. We have to recognize that at certain thresholds, it's going to get captured by global politics, but that doesn't mean that now the Arctic is more vulnerable because now Arctic boundaries are going to be more insecure. Or as, Dr. Riddle Dixon shared with your audience, it doesn't mean that now continental shelves, so the natural extension of our land masses under the Arctic Ocean, right, that all of a sudden now these are going to be arbitrated through military means. No, I don't think Russia is going to go there because it stands to gain the most if this unfolds according to the established UN overseen legal process and scientific process. So again, Russia's not doing it just because it's a nice actor, right? It's doing it because its national interest says it is going to benefit the most if it behaves according to plan, and if the rest of us do adhere to rules-based approaches. From that standpoint, I still think that the Arctic is more secure and more stable and less likely to spiral into unbridled military conflict than a lot of other places on Earth. But what we're now seeing is that more of the tensions of global affairs are affecting our Arctic relationships. And we can't simply think that we can talk about Arctic cooperation and focus on Arctic cooperation, peace and stability when we're facing a world that doesn't feel very cooperative right now, or at least feels a lot less cooperative than it did even a year ago.
Well,
right?
I'm
And it
not
doesn't.
sure where all of the blockage is occurring. I'd be interested because I've been in touch with various scientists who, especially people studying wildlife and forests and methane in the Arctic and so on, permafrost and so on. Also, this woman, Katie Anthony, who studies methane in lakes. And several of these people go to a place in Siberia run by the Zimovs, the father and son who have a research station in Cherkasy, I think. And they can't go this summer. They can't go, I don't know how long they'll be able to. It will be before they can do it again. They used to go and they were planning to go, but they can't anymore. Now, this other biologist that I will be interviewing, after all, although he was a little suspicious about what I had in mind, is in St. Petersburg, and he was saying, "Well, there's a ban, Well, I don't know what is he talking about. I think it would be a really, I think it has to be a very sad situation if ordinary relationships like phone calls and email exchanges and scientific conferences and so on have to be suspended when they're not really relevant to any of the conflicts going on, the disputes on Ukraine or any of the other relevant things. Who's doing this, and what ban was he talking about? Who started it?
Yeah, who started? I mean, I think the simple answer, and I'm not just being cheeky here. I mean, Putin started it when he launched his invasion of Ukraine. This was the shock to the system that meant that a lot of relationships that many of us enjoy, I include, have strong academic collaborations and friendships with some Russian scholars as well that are on pause. This is caused by Russia's aggressive actions, full stop. Where it came down on the one hand was at the diplomatic level, right? This pause on Arctic Council activities, and the language crafted was until new modalities can be formed to be able to cooperate. So it wasn't canceling the Arctic Council. It wasn't booting Russia out of the Arctic Council. To my mind, there's no Arctic Council without Russia. It's the largest Arctic state, and certainly you can't talk circumpolar Arctic without involving Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of where it's coming from, because it meant that all of the activities formally sponsored by the Arctic Council were also put on pause. In recent weeks, there has been a resumption of some activities, lower level scientific activities, but ones not involving Russian scientists or Russian partners. Mm-hmm. So it still goes back to your question. So who's, in essence, canceling out that scientific cooperation? As I see it, the challenge is several-fold. First of all, several Russian higher education institutions have formally and explicitly stated their support for the invasion of Ukraine and for Vladimir Putin. That raises questions, A, about the ethics of continuing to partner with them in a formal way, or to partner with individuals teaching at those institutions or researching through those institutions, in terms of us showing our support for Ukraine and demonstrating that we're not going to tolerate a complete violation of the sovereignty of an independent state along the lines of what Russia has done, that we're not going to allow Russia to use scientific cooperation or scientific diplomacy as a way and try to suggest that the West will eventually come around and concede and overlook what they've done in Ukraine and normalize relations. Obviously, Russia has a vested interest into wanting to continue business as usual on certain fronts. I'll also admit I'm very leery to interact with my Russian colleagues, because Putin has stated that anybody who doesn't support his regime and support this war is a traitor. His language, with all that connotes in Russian history and in what is an increasingly Russian authoritarian state. So my worry is, how can I, in good conscience, interact with Russian colleagues without feeling like if I'm speaking what I'm obligated to do as an academic, to speak through academic freedom, to speak truth to power? Is it dangerous that if I'm interacting with them, that they're going to be accused of guilt by association with me? and therefore be targeted or labeled as traitors. So I see it also as a question of, has some of the collateral damage from this war in Ukraine spilled over into the academic sphere and the science sphere, where we're now asking questions about whether Russian scientists can be considered independent actors, when we can treat science as something that is more apolitical than most other things. Meta, you and a lot of your viewers, right, will remember these were big questions that we toiled with in the Cold War. And over time, we found ways to engage. Polar bear treaties, scientific exchanges, permafrost researchers, engineers, eventually indigenous leaders going and sharing practices, all before the coming down of the Berlin Wall. What I'm still hoping is that over time, we will see a resolution of this war and an end to this war in Ukraine on terms that are acceptable to Ukrainians, and that over time we are able to rebuild trust relationships and resume things like joint scientific practices, because ultimately a world that I see as being peaceful and stable and sustainable requires information sharing, and it's often through scientists, through other academics, that we can achieve those human-to-human relationships that are so important. But the challenge is to be, how can we do it without sacrificing our principled stand regarding a belligerent who caused a brutal, unnecessary, unfair war? And we're all seeing on TV the thousands of people whose lives are being lost, whose properties are being destroyed, and it was not their fault. And my gosh, still first and foremost, right now, at least in 2022, our first priority is to make sure that we're in no way suggesting that this is behavior that somebody can get away with.
Well, I've been very preoccupied with how to assess what is reasonable in terms of contact with people in Russia. I have, for example, probably 50 or 60 Facebook friends who are Russian. Not that I know all of them, but we've somehow got that connection. And I do have longstanding friendships, which have been ruined already. Longstanding, I mean, like people who are closest, my own family, have been, our relationship is, I don't know whether it's permanently ruined, but it's not good. But of course, that's true for Russians themselves. Their own friendships, their own family relations are being impaired. So that kind of thing is one level of question that I don't know where that's going to go. How do you repair after somebody has taken a position that you think is unconscionable? How do you pick up from there and act as if it hasn't happened? That's going to be a problem. But what I'm wondering is, to what extent are actual action, mitigation of the effects, for example, of climate change, to the extent that anything is being done to actually solve problems, are any of those actions being impaired by the breach in relationships between scientists or even government officials from Russia and the rest of the countries?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's in a way still too early to tell, but my speculation would be yes, definitely, that the unfortunate outcome of this deterioration in global relations and even uncertainty, that's a topic of a lot of conversation in the West about what this means, what the war means for China-Russia relations.
Yes.
And whether or not we're seeing, alliance, there's a long history, as many of your viewers will remember, right, between the Soviet Union and China, of distrust that still exists there. I don't think I don't see them as allies the way some people are talking about it, but in terms of a partnership, even of convenience or of necessity, in the face of sanctions, if we're looking at through Russian eyes, right, is there. I think all of that uncertainty, is, and maybe I will even be bold enough to say likely to affect short-term advancing of what I think are really essential global relationships to deal with what is truly the foremost existential crisis facing humanity, which is climate change. And, I even look at some of the recent communiques coming out of NATO, both the Warsaw communique and the Madrid communiques, emphasizing that, when we're looking at now adopting language, talking about China as a competitor with NATO, with the West, but also really emphasizing explicitly that even if we're competing in some areas, we still must be very careful that our strategic dialogue doesn't impair our ability to encourage China to work with us dealing with climate change. And I'm like, yes, thank gosh.
Mhm.
I hope that same logic will be applied to relations with Russia to say this is one area where the stakes are far too grave to long-term suggest that we are not going to be in any room with any Russian representative, given that we have often been in rooms with, historically, with Russia, Soviet dictators, but also with other individuals who are not like-minded, representing authoritarian regimes, because we have to work together, whether it's the United Nations or other mechanisms, to deal with big issues collectively. I do hope that, and again, I'm not sure to put a precise month or date on it, but longer term, I think that's going to be one of the challenges calling for the most creativity is how do we re-engage?
Okay,
Because
now,
we have
but
to
already there, even if there were no breach or no war, there would be questions in my mind about how much cooperation you can expect from scientists and especially government officials that actually have policy-making roles, because Putin has been very, very, very slow to get on to being aware of global warming as a serious threat. I mean, some of them still are enthusiastic about the fact that the permafrost is going to melt, and whoopee, we're going to have more farmland. Well, do you know what's going to come with that? I mean, so I don't know whether many or most or any Soviet Russian scientists, I shouldn't use the word Soviet, but that shows where I came from back in the day. But Russian scientists, to what extent do they themselves feel constrained about getting clear and making it very explicit that they need to do things and that there needs to be cooperation? So what I'm seeing is, for example, in the IPCC, I mean, I would say the IPCC has to be, it's not very good. It hasn't worked very well, but it has to be an organization that's going to have a decisive impact on how quickly we get some action, political action, jointly, globally. And if the IPCC is all fragmented because of Russian denial, I think, frankly, I would call it climate denial in to some extent, officially, and it hasn't totally been overcome as far as I can tell. How bad is that problem going to be, or is it already a problem?
Yeah, Mette, I think it's a great question. I mean, certainly if we do continue to see obstacles to scientific cooperation, conversations in which globally scientists are getting together and sharing their data. The downside is if Russian scientists are left out of that conversation, if the Russian media is not listening to those conversations, if Russian academic publications are not informing policy on the basis of those, well, then in essence, we're potentially contributing to a bigger problem that Russia needs to be part of the solution ultimately, because it is part of the problem. The other tricky thing I find is we're going to have to figure out how also, or decide on whether we're capable of being able to speak to Russia about things like climate change, where we're not treating them as inherently a pariah and wrapping it up where every conversation is a way to scold them about the war on Ukraine, which again, I'm emotional about it. So right now I want to say every time we come, into conversation, if Prime Minister Trudeau or Minister Freeland is coming in, I hope she's talking about the war in Ukraine and how it's messing everything up and Russia end your illegal war. Okay, but longer term, I think, figuring out are we prepared? Do we want to ensure that we're echoing back to Russia some of their own statements on the importance of dealing with climate change and being a responsible environmental steward and focus on sustainable development? We've done some work within the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network of how some of those concepts are used by Russians. And sometimes, as you said, it's a little different the way they conceptualize things like sustainable development from the way we talk about it in the West. But certainly the effort of trying to align or encourage Russians to more align their thinking about these issues with what the scientists are demonstrating in the West and globally, is important. And it, to me, is an essential precondition to eventually dealing collectively, globally, with climate change. But it's going to be tricky because, again, right now, I'm not feeling very generous. I mean, I am angry. I'm angry. I'm highly hurt by what I see as a fundamental breach of trust.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get back to saying, a conversation that also suggests where might we believe that it's in our desired interest, our strategic interest, to be kind of generous and say, all right, Russia, you do have some scientists who are really good. They are demonstrating, how permafrost degradation leads to accelerated methane release, methane being a particularly noxious sort of contributor to accelerated global warming. Mm-hmm. So, hey, the Russians are doing good research on this. We're listening. Russia, help us to deal with this. And then, like we've dealt with, I think, with the United States at times, right? When you deal with those climate change denier types, to realize and treat them very much as a marginal voice, because they are. They're not backed by science. They really are, in my mind, an increasingly out of touch community. And I don't mean to dismiss them as human beings, but to say in terms of, if we are going to live in a world that's actually backed by evidence, the evidence is incontrovertible at this stage. So realizing that within every community, within every country, there are scientists, and I would even say the majority of scientists are not deniers. If they really are the experts, they're aware of this. How do we make sure that they are brought in and their research is also amplified to help to establish the issue?
Well, you see that as I think absolutely, I agree with you that I'm doing everything I know how to do easily within reach to retain and enhance conversations across that gulf now. And there are some people who are trying to do that, but I guess I hope it doesn't actually impair your own work. You're mostly focused in Canada, so you're not too dependent on interactions with people in foreign countries. Is that right?
No, I do have very close research collaborations with a lot of colleagues in the United States, in the Nordic countries, other parts of Europe, the United Kingdom, and so on. But unfortunately, yes, this has certainly affected my ability to work with Russian colleagues, whose work I greatly admire and respect. But sadly, given the nature of the institutions that they're with, and in certain cases, their own personal stances that they've declared through social media and elsewhere on this war, those relationships are affected by it, as you said. But I do think, as we look forward to the coming months and years, and hopefully whatever positive resolution we can even imagine after in the wake of this awful war, but think about the role that civil society actors, academics, scientists, what role we can play to be able to hopefully build back towards a sufficiently trusting relationship that we can, be able to advance things that are important, dealing with climate change, and ultimately we're all investing in global peace, right? They're wonderful, rich debates that are as old as we are, in terms of thinking about how you achieve peace and how you achieve stability. But ultimately, that's something that unifies us as human beings. That ultimately, the vast, vast majority of us want to have that peace. We want to have that stability.
That's exactly the right concluding remarks, because we've come a little over time, but it's really been a very important conversation, I think. And I really hope to stay in touch with you about this and that you continue to do this very important research. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Meta.
Good to get
thank you for having me. And for your viewers as well, if you're interested in reading more on this, a lot of our research is available open access at naadsn.ca. So Nadsen with 2 A's.ca.
Okay, carry on. Bye. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode number 480. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around, because we have conversations there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.